Hi. This week we are looking at making distinctions, the different ways that cultures divide themselves up into kinds of people, and particularly those distinctions that create barriers. Last time we were looking at how cultures think about sex and how they conceptualize sexual differences as culturally defined genders. Now, one of the challenges that you run into when you look at gender is that it's something that people define in natural terms. Anthropologists have found that ideas about gender vary tremendously among cultures. But most people in most cultures don't believe that. They think of sex and gender as pretty much the same thing. And they think about gender categories that they live with as something that's dictated by the basic biology and psychology of human beings. And that's as true for us as it is for anyone else. There's a lot of debate in the United States right now about the nature of gender, with different people arguing very forcefully for particular models of what genders there are and what characteristics are associated with them. If you listen to them, though, you'll find that they tend to share a belief in the biological origin of whatever model they endorse. It's not that they don't see gender identities as natural, for the most part, but that they feel that they understand the nature involved better than the people that they're arguing with. Now, I'm not making fun of that. The idea that things that we see as natural divisions are really culturally derived is a very, very hard concept to get your head around. It's really hard to believe that something that seems to exist as a hard and fast part of the natural world isn't actually determined by nature at all. For most Americans, that's true of gender, and it's also true of our subject for today, which is race. Most Americans, if you ask them, would tell you that they know quite well that biological races exist. Here in the United States, you've got a number of races: whites, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans, maybe a few other groups. And people would say that those are biologically different from one another. They look different, they have different ancestry, they originate in different parts of the world, and they usually have somewhat different cultures. The existence of those races poses some real questions for a democratic society like ours. How, for example, should we deal with racial differences? Should we let them organize our social world so that people of different races live separately from one another? Or should we try to ignore racial differences as we set up social groups and jobs and neighborhoods? How do we judge people as members of racial groups? Do we see them through prejudice categories, or do we see them for the individual people they are? How do we keep race from limiting people's abilities to go to college or find a job or start a business or rent an apartment? Those are the kinds of questions we're always asking ourselves about race in our political and public discussion. And I want to stress that these are really important, really critical questions to ask. But for most Americans, all of these questions build on a basic fact, that people really do belong to biological races. What if that weren't true? What if race didn't really exist as something biologically? What if it was something that we believed was real, but which really wasn't? What would that mean for the kinds of questions we should ask about race, for the kind of policies and programs we should set up to deal with racial divisions? How would that affect concepts of justice and opportunity and equality in the United States? Now, those are important questions because that's actually what most anthropologists have concluded about race. As a biological category, race doesn't exist. It's not out there in nature. It's something created by culture, something that most people believe is determined by biology, but which isn't. Now, I want to stress that anthropologists don't say this because we think it's a nice idea, but it's because it's the only way we can make sense of the data that are out there. Now, in our time today, I'd like to do three things. One is to tell you a little bit about the history of the study of race in anthropology, to show you how we landed at this conclusion. Then I'd like to address a question that most people have once they hear it. If race isn't a real thing, how do we make sense of the fact that different groups of people look different from one another? In other words, how do anthropologists make sense of human physical variation? Finally, I'd like to tell you a couple of things about something we raised last week, the question of ethnicity. If we're going to think about human differences in terms of ethnicity rather than race, then it's important to have a sense of what ethnicity means and some of the complexities it implies in the modern cultural context.